We often hear about the war that pitted brother against brother, the one that tore the United States right in two. And in the end, it really did forge a new nation in blood and fire. We are, of course, talking about the American Civil War, and it's no exaggeration to call it the country's deadliest and maybe its most defining conflict. Just look at this number, over 700,000. That's how many soldiers are estimated to have died. To put that into perspective, that's more American lives lost than in all of the nation's other wars combined, all the way up through the Vietnam War. I mean, think about that. This wasn't just some conflict. It was a total national cataclysm.
So the big question is, how did it even get to this point, right? How does a nation that was founded on these high ideals of liberty and unity end up turning on itself with such just unbelievable ferocity? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dive into here. We're going to trace that path from a deeply divided nation to an all-out war.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with how the nation literally broke apart. Then we'll get to the first shots that kicked everything off. After that, we'll look at the big turning point when the tide really started to shift. Then it's the Union's final brutal push for victory. And we'll wrap up by looking at the lasting scars this war left behind. Okay, let's jump right into part one, A Nation Breaks. Now, this didn't happen overnight. The road to disunion was a long one, really. You had decades of this simmering conflict, mostly over the institution of slavery, and it all finally just boiled over with the presidential election of 1860. So the winner of that election was a guy named Abraham Lincoln. He was a Republican, and his big stance was opposing the expansion of slavery into new territories out west. Now, for Southern leaders, this was more than just a political loss. It was an existential threat. They were terrified that this was the first step toward getting rid of slavery altogether. And the response? Well, it was the most drastic thing you could imagine: secession. They just up and declared their states were leaving the Union to form a brand new country, the Confederate States of America. And, there's been a lot of debate over the years about the causes of the war, but the seceding states themselves, they were incredibly clear about their motives. If you just read their own official documents, like this declaration from Mississippi, they state it plainly. For them, it was all about protecting and preserving the institution of slavery. That was their primary reason for leaving the Union. So if you look at the resources on paper at the start of the war, it really looks like a total mismatch. I mean, the Union had these just overwhelming advantages in almost every way you can measure. Way more people, way more factories, way more railroads. On paper, you'd think no contest. But those numbers don't tell the whole story. They kind of hide the fact that the South had some really formidable military leaders. And just as important, they only had to fight a defensive war to win. All right, that brings us to part two, the first shots fired. This is where that huge political crisis just explodes into an actual shooting war. And the spark that lit the whole thing on fire, it happened right here, at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. President Lincoln tried to send supplies to this federal fort, and Confederate forces just opened fire, bombarding it until it surrendered. Well, that attack completely galvanized the North. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. And what happened next? 4 more Southern states seceded in response. And just like that, the war was on. In the beginning, there was this huge wave of patriotism. You had volunteers just flocking to sign up on both sides, thinking it would be a short, glorious adventure. But that enthusiasm faded really fast once the true horror and length of the war became clear. Pretty soon, both the Union and the Confederacy had to resort to a military draft to fill their ranks. And let me tell you, that was a deeply unpopular move, but it just goes to show you how desperate both sides were for more soldiers. Okay, moving on to part 3, the tide turns. So for the first 2 years, the fighting was just brutal, bloody, and honestly, pretty inconclusive. But then comes 1863, and this year marks a huge shift in the war's momentum. And it was all driven by one really powerful political move and a couple of key military victories. And that first big shift, it came from Lincoln himself with the Emancipation Proclamation. This was an executive order, and it declared that all enslaved people in the states that were in rebellion were, from that moment on, forever free. It was an absolute masterstroke. Why? Because it completely reframed the purpose of the war. It wasn't just about preserving the Union anymore. Now it was a moral crusade against slavery. And that also had a huge diplomatic effect. It basically crippled any chance the Confederacy had of getting help from anti-slavery countries like Great Britain. And you can really see how the military and political sides of the war started feeding off each other here. First, the Union gets this incredibly bloody victory at Antietam. That gave Lincoln the political cover he needed to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. Then, the proclamation itself officially allows the Union to recruit African American soldiers, which was a huge boost to their manpower. And it all leads up to this incredible moment in July 1863 when the Union wins two massive, decisive victories at almost the exact same time: Gettysburg in the east and Vicksburg in the west. It was a 1-2 punch that the Confederacy really could never recover from. But wow, this turning point came at a human cost. That is, well, it's almost unimaginable. Just look at these figures. At Antietam, you had over 22,000 casualties in a single day. That's still the bloodiest single day in all of American history. Then, at Gettysburg, over 50,000 in just 3 days. This was slaughter on an industrial scale. It was unlike anything anyone on this continent had ever seen before. So now we get to part 4, the Union's final push. At this point, the tide has clearly turned in the Union's favor, and so they adopt a new and much more ruthless strategy designed to bring this war to an end once and for all. And this is where Lincoln finally finds the general he's been looking for this whole time, Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant wasn't your classic, brilliant tactician. He was more of a bulldog. He just wouldn't let go. And he understood something crucial. To win this war, the Union had to do more than just beat the Confederate armies on the battlefield. They had to completely destroy the South's ability and its will to keep fighting. Grant's strategy was as simple as it was brutal. Just apply constant, coordinated pressure from all sides. So while Grant himself took on Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia in this relentless war of attrition, he ordered another general, William Tecumseh Sherman, to punch deep into the Confederate heartland. This became known as total war, and it was a shocking new idea back then, because it meant the battlefield wasn't just where the armies fought anymore. The battlefield was now everywhere: the farms, the railroads, the entire economic and social fabric of the South. And maybe the most famous or infamous example of this total war strategy was Sherman's March to the Sea. After his army captured the crucial city of Atlanta, they just cut a 60-mile-wide path of destruction straight across Georgia, all the way to the coast. I mean, this march didn't just shatter the Southern economy, it shattered the morale of its people. Finally, after being just ground down by Grant's constant attacks, with his army starving and completely surrounded, General Robert E. Lee had no other choice. On April 9, 1865, he surrendered to Grant at a little farmhouse in a place called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Now, a few other Confederate armies fought on for a couple more weeks, but for all intents and purposes, this was the end of the American Civil War. Okay, so that brings us to our final section, a war's lasting scars. The fighting might have been over, but the impact of this conflict, well, it would echo for generations, leaving these incredibly deep wounds on the soul of the nation. But here's something that might surprise you when you look at how these soldiers died. The war's biggest killer, it wasn't the enemy's bullets, it was bacteria. Yeah, for every one soldier who was killed in combat, 2 died from disease. These crowded, unsanitary army camps were just breeding grounds for things like dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia. It's just a grim reminder of the brutal conditions these guys had to live through. So, in the end, the war really did settle 2 huge fundamental questions. First, it confirmed that the Union was one single, indivisible nation. And second, it abolished slavery for good with the 13th Amendment, which freed 4 million people. But it also left the entire South in ruins and kicked off this incredibly difficult and controversial period that we now call Reconstruction. So yeah, the war answered the question of whether the United States would even survive as one country, and it absolutely destroyed the institution of slavery. But it left behind a much deeper, more painful question, one that honestly still echoes to this day. Did it truly heal the divisions that caused the war in the first place? Those 4 years of bloodshed completely redefined America, for sure. But the struggle to form that more perfect union, well, that was far from over.